Hello,
Carol.
Hello, Carol. Hi, all right.
Hiya, I'm great, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm not too bad. Justin gets all technical with this stuff.
He's some sort of technical whiz. This is what I've heard.
Oh yes. Oh yes.
It is. If only you let me listen to the distillery, I would come up with a global new renaissance in whiskey. Probably not, but there you go.
I'll give it a word. Now we're joined by. Now, I've been looking forward to talking to this woman for quite a while now. She has. I suppose in some ways there's not that many sort of sexy jobs in historical terms and archivist jobs. But she has one because Carol Quinn is in charge of the Jameson Archive. Carol, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Marty. I've been described now as having a couple of things, but never a sexy archive job. So
no, but it kind of is, you know.
It's an interesting job. It's an enviable. That's what we'll say. It's an enviable job.
Enviable job.
If Marty builds it up anymore, Elon Musk will want to buy the archive. So
that's
better not.
I suppose if he made me an offer, I'd have to consider it.
Well, he seems to be making lots of offers these days. World Hunger at now Twitter, he just pays cash for them, as you do. 44 billion, just write a check. Now, Carol, explain to us the Jameson Archive spans. What you take is it's about 200 years worth, is it?
Yep, absolutely. I'll pull things back a bit, Marty, because I think for some of the viewers, they mightn't have come across an archivist before. Okay. So I think I'll start just by explaining what the job and the role is and how you get there, because I think people like to know that. So archives really are the raw materials of history. Mm-hmm. They're the records generated by either companies or individuals, you know, yourself and myself, the letters we might write, the bills we receive. In the course of a business, it would be all your administrative records.
Yeah.
And they are preserved then for their information value. They no longer have a role in the running of a company, but we keep them because of the information that they contain. And a good example of that would be, say, the wage books from the historic Jameson Distillery in Bow Street.
Yeah.
You needed to keep a wage book because you needed to know who was on your books. And
the tax man's interested in those.
Yeah, I have a lot of revenue records. And you need to know what everyone's paid. So there's an ongoing need. Now, we keep those because they're of huge genealogical interest. There's people all over the world who had relatives who worked in Bow Street, and we keep them for that information. So that's what archives are. And an archivist then is the person whose job is to manage the physical custody. So that's looking after something that is by definition unique. Because there's not, now, unless you're being very cagey with the revenue, there's not going to be two sets, we'll say, of wage books. You don't write two sets of the same letters to somebody.
If he was running a business, there'd be definitely two sets.
I'm getting the vibe from Justin. All right, that could be interesting. But so there's a physical looking after items which are unique and completely irreplaceable.
Yeah,
you know, it's not. Sorry, it's not like you drop something and you can go out and you can buy a replacement.
No. Now, I said there's 200 years worth of records there, including everything from basically the running of a big industry.
Yeah.
So you have, obviously that's a bulk of a huge amount of data and paperwork and letters and so on. Where do you start? How do you categorize this?
That's the archival training. And in Ireland, you do an MA in UCD, and it teaches you that archival administration. And the main thing, and this will just break all your hearts, is when you're going through the items, the main thing is don't get lost in them. Don't start reading them. And this is the difference between professional archivists and I'm going to say amateurs. You can get lost in reading it. You open a minute book, and for the purpose of an initial catalogue, you just need to know the covering dates. You need to know the type of information contained there. But if you're not focused on that, you'll start reading every page.
Yeah.
And a year will go by and you'll be no closer to having any sort of catalogue or any sort of handle on the collection. So it's a bit like eating an elephant, you know, you do it in little bits. You take a bite at a time. So for something like the Jameson Archive, which the vast bulk of it, there's some 18th century material, but the vast bulk is 19th century administrative records. And like, I know you're already thinking, oh, fantastic mash bills, you know, everything like this. There's a lot of receipts for coal, and there's a lot of sales reps expenses, you know, and you need to kind of go through that, acknowledge it. But then
you're taking the shine off that for me about Carol. You're taking the shine off that. There's lots of the romance of it.
But Carol, listen, you're bound to have looked through it, right? And say you look through it and you discover inconsistencies. What do you do? Who do you bring that up to? So say, for example, you had receipts for 1,000 tons of coal, and you knew 1,000 tons of coal could make 10,000 barrels of whiskey, but you only made 5,000 barrels of whiskey. Where did the other 5,000 barrels of whiskey go? Have you ever discovered any inconsistencies like that in the archive?
This is an interesting point, because that's not the job of an archivist.
Right.
My job is simply to preserve the material and to disseminate the information that's in it. It's up to a third party, then more usually a historian, to interpret and to do all of that. So the job of an archivist is really the preservation and the dissemination, but it's not actively the interpretation. Now, as part of my role, I do like to share a lot of the information and some of the stories, because there's such, as you know yourself, such a wide audience who are really interested in the history of Irish whiskey, and we're the only distillery that has its own archives and has an archivist on staff. So I think it'd be a bit mean if I didn't share some of the stories.
Now, in terms of preserving the archive, that obviously has its own challenges, because you're dealing with probably quite fragile material. For you know, something that's 200 years old, paper-wise, is obviously quite fragile. So what's the process? Do you digitize it, or do you get it on electronically, or is it preserved in some other way?
Well, the first thing you have to think about is where you're actually going to physically keep the material. And I'd say this to anybody, you know, who's watching at home, and you might have something, letters belong to your parents, your grandparents, you might have some photographs that you quite treasure. You can make a digital copy. That won't preserve anything. That doesn't preserve the original. And there is nothing like that tactile experience of handling something that somebody last touched 100 years ago, 150 years ago. When you scan it or digitize, what happens is you create two silos. You create the physical one, and then you create a digital one. And we'll refer to Justin here. Maintaining millions of digital scans is no fun. So the first thing to do is you think about where things are being housed. And if you're doing this at home yourself, what I'd say to people is people very often put something precious into those, you know, those plastic sleeves that you get for ring binders. Stay away from those. Plastic degrades and it'll stick to the paper. And when you try and take out your precious letter, the ink will be left on the plastic. So don't do that.
Okay. Handy.
Don't put it in a brown envelope and write on the front Granny's wedding photograph, because the next time you open it, it's going to be a ball of acid. Try, ideally, is just put something away in the dark. That is the best thing that you can do. And for Irish Distillers, in 2013, we converted the Distillers Cottage in Midleton. And from the outside, it's a beautiful Georgian villa. It still is a beautiful Georgian villa. But inside, we created 5 strong rooms. They're all temperature controlled and they're all fully humidity controlled. And all the beautiful windows have UV filters on them, so that the daylight coming in isn't going to cause a reaction to anything that the sunlight might fall on inside. Now, in the strong rooms, there's obviously no external light whatsoever. So it is built to international museum standards. So that's your first tip. Keep away from the damp, keep away from the light, and the thing that causes most damage is people.
Yeah.
You know, so it's
not typical of everything. Is that not just sort of typical? That's sort of
it's kind of a rule for life. You want to keep things flat and not folded. And again, this is a tip for anyone at home with an old letter, because every time you unfold it, you're moving that crease almost like a hinge. And you're going to weaken it. So keep things flat. Try and keep them in the dark, and try and handle as little as possible. Now, there's specialist storage equipment that is acid-free folders and boxes, and that's what we would use.
And do you use do you have like those humidity boxes to take any moisture out
We
of the
do.
air?
Dehumidifiers, we do. Yeah, we try and keep everything within a recognized range for paper. Now, the archive as well, as you can imagine, it isn't just paper in a distillery. We have a lot of bottles. So there's a separate room for the bottles because, again, you'd have slightly different storage needs.
Yeah. Well, I assume, does the glue, whenever the labels put on it, does the glue react over time with the paper, or does that separate and stuff?
No, but if it's kept in too dry a condition, it'll actually degrade and your label will just pop off. It will just literally pop off, which isn't great when you want to know what's in the bottle.
I'm just thinking about somewhere cold, dark, that doesn't see light very often. I could store stuff in Justin's wallet. That would probably be a good place to put it.
I've heard no human hand has ever been near it, so I think that would be safe.
In terms of, you say there about mash bills, but there's lots of receipts for coal, but that sort of tells its own story as well.
Oh, of course, yes.
Because obviously they were using coal direct fire. In terms of.
Oh yeah, completely. And I mean, for the vast majority of the running of the historical distilleries in Ireland, and certainly in the golden age of Irish whiskey about the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, it was pretty much coal driven. And that's one of the reasons why you tend to get distilleries in Ireland being based, historically now, being based in urban centres. Because it's certainly about getting your product out and being able to distribute it, but it's about being able to get the raw ingredients to create your product in, and coal would have been so necessary. Just to kind of give you a picture, in Midleton, in Old Middleton Distillery, where I'm based, the largest pot still in the world, which is still the largest pot still in the world, was erected there in 1854 by the Murphy family who ran Middleton Distillery. And it could heat up to 30,000 gallons of liquid. And it took 4 tons of coal a day to do that. So that's a lot. And Middleton Distillery is located near a natural harbour. It's called Ballinacurra. It's less than 2 kilometres from the distillery. And that's where the coal will come in from. And it's the same with Bow Street. It's a stone's throw from the River Liffey, which was a huge port. So it would come up along the Liffey, and it didn't have far to go. And the same with the city centre distilleries in Cork, the historic ones, North Mal, Hewitt's, all of those, again, near where you can get in your raw materials. People think that it's so important, and it was, to be near the barley fields. But equally, unless you can heat your still, your barley isn't going to do you much good.
No, in terms of even doing your maltings and stuff, you need the space. And
there's a huge amount of infrastructure involved in a distillery, and that's as true for 100 years ago as it is today. And distilleries, what I find very interesting about them is they don't exist separate to the community that they're located in. The employment is one very strong connection, but it's all these other things. It's the people employed on the horses and carts bringing your coal in. It's the farmers bringing the barley in. It is the army, the small army of craftspeople that you would need, from coppersmiths to blacksmiths to harness makers, carpenters, coopers. There's a whole infrastructure, and there still is today, possibly a few more environmental engineers today than there used to be, but it's still
more health and safety executives.
A few of them.
Now, you're talking about the team of people. Whenever you're the logistics of buying stuff these days, you just send an email and an invoice and all that. All of that back in the day.
No. I don't know where you do your shopping. It is still almost the same. The only difference is years ago, you would buy from a lot of individual farmers, and today we buy from a centralized grain merchant. But the process is exactly the same. 100 years ago, when the barley was coming in a sack on a horse and cart, it was stopped at the gate, a sample was taken, and it was tested. Primarily, they're looking for the correct moisture content because they don't want any fungus or anything like that. And the same thing happens today. Before it gets in the door, it is tested. Each batch is tested individually. So I think our barley buyer for a distillery from 100 years ago, he'd recognize the process. He
Yeah.
wouldn't know what the lorry was dropping it off, but
And he might
would
not have
understand the
an
process.
Excel spreadsheet either.
Yeah,
Yeah. Now, in terms of all the jobs, there must have been at times jobs that aren't necessary today. No.
Well, I suppose so. One job that kind of leaps out to me from the records that we have for the Powers Distillery at Johns Lane, they kept permanently on the payroll there brickmakers. You wouldn't necessarily think that you need a brickmaker to distill, but if you ever look at the historic images of the stills at John Street, you find they're set in almost a brick platform.
Yeah.
And that's how they're designed. And when the stills would heat up, you had massive amounts of heat and the bricks shatter. And Powers at that time was a global drink. It was being exported all over the world. So you're not going to stop production for the sake of a broken brick. So they kept full-time brickmakers on staff. So that's a trade set that we don't find at Midleton today.
Brickmaker and bricklayer.
Yeah.
Carol, does anybody ever come up out of the blue with a big box or a big bundle of stuff and say, here you go, I found this in my grandfather's shed when I was clearing it out?
Well, actually, I've been very lucky with things like that. When I first started in the role about 9 years ago, we put out a call to employees because very often in a distillery, you tend to get a tradition of sons following fathers into work. And so it was to put a call out for not only current employees, but retirees to, if they had anything that they thought, that they'd like to see preserved, to drop it in. So a lot of people did just that. So it was like permanently Christmas. You arrive into work, every day, a different box for you to open. And so I was very grateful for that. But back in the 1960s and the 1970s, when our two Dublin distilleries, the company I work for is Irish Distillers, and that was formed in 1966 by an amalgamation of Jameson Powers and the Middleton Distillery, run by the Cork Distilleries Company. And production, as you may know, transferred to Midleton in 1975, and that saw the two Dublin distilleries closed. But they were chock-a-block with all these records. And because Irish whiskey had been in a slump at that point, production was shrinking, which meant they were left with a lot of excess empty buildings that weren't really being used. So this is where the archives were kept. So, and not thrown out, which is the main thing. Archives tend to be thrown out when people downsize or when they sell and move. So the records were there, but the company didn't know what to do with them, but knew that they were valuable. So the National Archives in Dublin stepped in and actually mined them and stored them until such a time as the company could build a repository. So the first year was all of that material coming back in, and there was 45 pallets worth of material. So I think that was bones of 4 years. Have those and go through them.
That's just a huge body of work.
Yeah, but it was great because they survived, which we were incredibly grateful for.
Yeah. Now, you did a tie-up with Ancestry.
That's right. The archive is an internal resource for Irish distillers. And the reason for that is at the moment, it's not fully catalogued. If you came in and you said, I need to see all the records relating to X, Y, and Z, hand on heart, I couldn't tell you that I was giving you all the records. I just don't know yet because we haven't gone through them. We haven't processed them. So, but at the same time, I get a lot of external queries, especially genealogical.
Yeah.
And this was something that I was very passionate about because in Ireland, we don't have a lot of official records.
No.
Our last census that is freely available is the 1911. I know that there's work at the moment to try and process the 1921 census, but anything prior to 1901 was destroyed in the forecourts in 1922. You didn't have baptismal records till about the 1880s. So trying to find anything about your ancestors is quite difficult. Yeah. So this body of records is a data set for that. So I really wanted to make them publicly available, but I wasn't quite sure how.
Yeah.
And a colleague suggested that I contact Ancestry, who are the world's biggest providers of genealogical information. And they were just so incredibly helpful.
Yeah.
And what they did is they sent a crack team over who digitised in-house within the archive in Midleton 100 years of the wage books from Bow Street. Now, that sounds, just digitised.
No.
It's not that easy. And once you have an image, how do you search an image? All of these are handwritten. They needed all to be transcribed. The images needed to be cropped. There was about a year's work.
Wow.
In preparing them, but it was so worth it, and they're available now on the Ancestry site.
Yeah.
So you can just, if you sign up with them, and you have an account, you can log in. Now, if you don't have an account and you're just curious, if you contact me, because Ancestry have done all the hard work, I can look up a database. So it's been absolutely incredible, because archival material is irreplaceable, as I was mentioning.
Okay.
So prior to Ancestry coming on board, if somebody wrote in and they asked about an ancestor or grandfather, I had to usually make a guess at the years that that person would have been employed and take down these huge ledgers that are physically very large. They're about 1 meter in length, and open each page and physically go through them. So not only was that hours of my time, but every time you're turning a page, you're damaging. So now, because they have been scanned, we don't have to do that.
Excellent.
And it's a lot easier to preserve the physical hard copies.
Yeah, I kind of had it in my head that they just scanned them in, and they had some picture search.
Justin knows better than that.
Yeah.
And I suppose what I'd say to anybody, if you think about, even if you go look for a Word document that you created maybe 3 years ago, if you look at it on your hard drive, see if you can open it. Chances are you can't, because the software has moved on.
Yeah.
So you can spend an awful lot of money scanning everything. Somebody gives it to you. If it was a few years ago, they'd give it to you in a CD-ROM. Good luck with opening that.
Mhm.
And it's not like you can put it on a shelf and say that job is done.
Yeah.
There is another body of work in constantly migrating this sort of material. So that's why when you have somebody like Ancestry, who have a whole team of software engineers who are used to doing this, it's very, very useful, because it is an entire skill set in itself.
I suppose I don't give enough credit to this, the people doing these kind of things. I thought it was basically PDF, stuck on a photocopy.
I know, and you're done. Yeah. Oh, for 3 weeks holiday. No.
How many days that's that done? Sometime.
No.
Now, you say you don't, an archivist doesn't really go through the records piece, but it's a third party does that. But you must have picked up on doing it for other people. Whenever people say, I'm looking for my grandfather, you must have read some stories about people.
Oh, well, sometimes you have to read between the lines of a record.
That's what we mean. That's what we mean.
Yeah, that's what you're trying to get at. And that's where you can't beat living memory. And alongside the physical archive, we also have an oral history program that I do talk to former employees and record their memories.
Wow.
Because they tend to be a lot more colourful than the official record.
Yeah.
And sometimes you just think that the only reason anybody came to work was to steal whiskey. That there was literally nothing else on the agenda for the day, because that was the focus. But there was a very well-known character in the Cork Distilleries Company, a man called Mr. Norbert Murphy, who was known as Mr. Norbert. And he was the managing director for an incredible something like 70 years.
Wow.
And his motto was, we're not working in a lemonade factory. And by that he meant, if you put temptation in front of somebody, don't be shocked if they get tempted. And, and don't really, take that with a pinch of salt. So interestingly, and talking to our head cooper, Ger Buckley, he can tell you there's 100 ways to get whiskey out of an oak barrel, none of which involves removing the bung. So there's a whole skill set there. But there were such clever ways. One very popular way, and this used to happen in all the distilleries, but I heard about it from a man who worked in John's Lane, the Powers distillery, was he had what they used to call the hangman. And you take a baby bottle, empty baby bottle, conveniently with the screw top if you can get it. And you just tie a little twine around the neck of the bottle and the other little bit, the end of the twine around your wrist, and slip it up the sleeve of your coat. And if you're coming along and you happen to spot a barrel, down it drops, up it comes, screw on, you're grand. In Bow Street, they had a little kind of cubby area, for a canteen with a gas cooker that had no gas, because the teapot on it, if you put gas under it, that would have exploded. There was new made spirit completely 100% of the time in that teapot. And one of the first things you'd be told is never light the flame under that teapot. So that was one. In Midleton, they took it even a step further, and in front of what is now the cooperage area that you can see if you visit Old Midleton, it was an area known as the Seven Trees, because there were 7 trees growing there. And one of them had a hollowed out trunk. And the guys would keep a bottle of milk of magnesia there, the bright blue bottle, you might remember it. And of course, that was full of new make spirit. And you'd nudge your buddy and you'd just say, I'm off to the 7 Trees. And up they'd go, hand in the trunk. And if you were caught, it was milk and magnesia. You had an upset stomach.
Of course.
Of course.
I suppose that bright blue, you can't see really what's in it. So
you can't see what's in it. You take the man at his word. Now, again, I'm talking historically.
Oh yes. I remember hearing about a story of a lady I know. She lived up in Inverness, and they used to be bringing from Speyside just to come sort of through where she was and stuff. And she says that there was guys just to get a wee drill up into a cask. Out popped this wee thing. They filled their bottle and then they put matchsticks in to store it up.
Yeah.
But they just get very picky. They went, that cask rotten, went to another one. They were able to go through all these casks. They said it was just awesome. Just how quick they were able to do it.
Well, you would have had connoisseurs who were drinking the finest of spirit.
They were finding the best of stuff. They were complaining whenever it wasn't good enough. They just threw it away and stuff. Anyway, now, in terms of other bulks of work, you're talking about, the Ancestry database that's out there now. Is there more databases and data sets coming out?
Yeah. We've got plans for that, because as I go through the collection and I can say definitively that's what has survived of X or Y, then I'll involve Ancestry again. And we certainly have some in the pipeline. So watch this space.
Brilliant. Now, anyone who does the tour in Bow Street gets to hear your lyrical voice coming out about the time you discovered the barley corns.
Oh, that was absolutely incredible. After months of trawling through sales reps' expenses.
Cool receipt.
Full receipt. What you're referring to there is a notebook from 1826, and it's the handwritten notebook kept by John Jameson, the son of the founder of Bow Street, so John Jameson II. And he was a hands-on distiller, and he was recording the daily mash bills for Jameson whiskey. Now, this is something that when we have new entries to the company and they come down to the archive and you're trying to tell them a little bit about the history and the heritage of Jameson, to have that physical link, that you can look at the handwriting of John Jameson and his mash bills. It's a very emotive thing. So this is obviously a very, very precious notebook. And when I came across it, it was pretty much in tatters. The cover had come off. It wasn't in great shape. So I sent it to a paper conservator. We use the services of Paul Curtis, who's based in Mucker's House in Killarney. He's an absolutely fantastic paper conservator. So I sent it down to him for repairs. And as part of that repair, he took the binding off. And when he took the binding off, out of the spine of the book fell these little barley grains. And they were trapped. When John Jameson closed this notebook, shoved it in his pocket, he trapped the actual barley that was making Jameson whiskey in 1826. Absolutely amazing.
And got to 200 years ago. That's incredible.
It is incredible. And when I went down to collect the book, Paul, almost as an afterthought, said, "Oh, by the way, I must give you this." And I was like, "Oh, yes, you must." So we have them, and we've currently partnered with a laboratory in France, and we're actually trying to get. I gave up two of the precious kernels. We're trying to get almost the DNA broken down to see what variety they were, and to see maybe what's the closest modern equivalent. What's grown today that is like this. So our master distiller, Kevin O'Gorman, is a complete history buff. He absolutely loves it. And this was very much his passion project. He really wanted to know about the barley. And so you never know where that might lead.
Yeah, what's that space, you know?
Yeah.
And I mean, you referred to that book. I mean, that book, it's a museum piece, essentially. You know, it's,
absolutely.
That's really, I don't want to say, but that's really, it belongs in a museum. Now, it has the mash bills and the day-to-day running of the distillery. The thing, one of the attractive things about whiskey is you do have this sense of history and heritage. And, to have that physical record. Can we see something in the future where they're bringing back some of the mash bills that he used at the time? Is that maybe where the company would at some point?
I suppose never say never. But what tends to happen is the company and the distilling team and the blending team, actually, they use those as inspiration.
Yeah.
Because it's not so much about recreating the past, because you can't. You can never recreate the past. The equipment is different. Standards are different. Standards of hygiene are different. There might be a signature taste or flavor from 100 years ago that you really don't want to delve into.
Yeah.
So you never really truly can recreate the past, but you can use it for inspiration. And that's what the team in Midleton use a lot. You might have seen recently there was the reintroduction of a Jameson single pot still. And again, that came out of looking at the record and seeing what was Jameson famous for? What made its whiskey great at its height in the 1880s? And of course, it was single pot still.
Yeah.
So the team said, well, why don't we create this for the modern era, for right now?
Yeah.
What would a Jameson pot still taste like right now? So they did come to the archive, they did look at the mash bills, and the design team looked very closely at old labelings. And you can see there's a homage to the old labelling on the modern bottle. But it's never so much about recreating, but it's causing a springboard.
Yeah.
And also what I think that it gives the distilling team is a sense of their place in history, and gives them a sense of continuity. That they're the here and now, but there was a past and there will be a tomorrow. And it's about maintaining standards.
Yeah.
You know, Irish whiskey was always a byword for a high quality product.
Yeah.
And it's about maintaining that for the now and for the future.
Yeah. I mean, now with this, I mean, the huge renaissance in Irish whiskey that's happening at the minute, and led primarily by Jameson. I mean, Jameson, I've heard recently someone saying, really, there's two categories of Irish whiskey. You have Jameson and everybody else, and there's a lot of truth in that. With it, the new renaissance, historically, do you see the records going up and down? You know, the amount of good times, bad times, bad times, and historical events in Ireland. You know, the War of Independence and the establishment of the Free State, and outside influences having an impact on. Well,
this is the thing that we mentioned earlier. The distilleries didn't operate independently of the communities they were located in, or the political circumstances of the day. And I think from the earliest records I have, almost on an annual basis, it's a deputation to the government giving out about the amount of tax on whiskey.
And rightly so. And rightly so.
And rightly so. Very rightly so, but they obviously didn't get very far because they were still giving out about it. So that's been a very consistent theme, is the taking of, or the addition of, an awful lot of extra money on a bottle of whiskey that, you know, inevitably as the consumer is targeted at. But exactly to your point, there's been a lot of ups and downs and external factors influencing Irish whiskey, because when you look at it, the product itself kind of remained unchanged for many generations. And as I mentioned, it was something that was associated with luxury goods, with prestige and with premium. But if you fast forward to the 1950s and 1960s, people would say Irish what? Oh, that stuff.
Yeah.
That you man sitting in the corner there with the flat cap and the Jack Russell, that's what he's drinking.
Yeah.
And that decline came about completely because of external factors, one after the other.
Yeah.
And it starts with the First World War, because Irish whiskey was an export-driven item. It was sold all over the world. I often mention, as I go through the archives, we have a lot of what's called label books containing all the labels for the different territories, because then as now you need there's different legal requirements.
Yeah.
And I have a Jameson label from about 1910 for Honolulu. They're selling enough that they need a specific label for Honolulu. So I think that really shows you the global aspect of it. And Ireland is an island. And if you're going to get it off the island, it's going to be by boat. So the First World War saw a lot of submarine activity around Ireland, and the sinking of merchant shipping and the absolute stopping of exports.
Yeah.
So, and that the distilleries have no control over that whatsoever.
No.
And in looking at the distillers' ledgers for Jameson in particular, as the First World War comes to an end in 1919, they're thrilled with themselves and they write, "We had the best distilling season on records. The equipment is working perfectly. The barley was great. Everything went, and they had their largest yield." And that was the year, of course, that saw prohibition being brought in.
Yeah.
Another external factor that they have no control over.
Yeah.
That's followed then by a trade war with Britain, with the United Kingdom, which, we tend to think of in terms of, okay, that's just trade between Ireland and Britain, but it wasn't. It was with the British Empire.
That's about a third of the globe at that point.
Absolutely. So that meant trade gone with India, trade gone with Australia, trade gone with New Zealand, Canada. Yeah. They just lost America, and now they're losing all of these. Yeah. That's bad. So, but they grit the teeth and they put the head down and they stay true to their product. Now they try other things. They need income because they're not selling whiskey.
Yeah.
So in the 1950s, in the 1940s, 1941, you see the introduction of cork dry gin for the first time by the Cork Distilleries Company to try and generate some income. Powers opened a gin still in the 1950s in John's Lane, again trying to get in this extra income. But you, of course, had the Second World War, and then you have economic recession after war. So really, by the 1960s, they're on their knees.
Yeah.
And you see so many distilleries have just shut. They've just shut because the market wasn't there. But again, none of this was in the control of the distillers. So at the moment, we're living through extremely unsettled and strange times.
Yeah.
But if you stand back and you look at the last 500-600 years, these are things like this has happened before. It's not 100 years since the Great Spanish Flu epidemic.
No.
People lived through what we're living through now and realized that opening a window is a good thing. And, that kind of memory seems to got forgotten, and we all wanted to live in very sealed houses, but a good breeze is no harm.
Yeah.
And you have all of these, and I think it's your resilience. And a lot of that will be belief in the integrity of your product.
Yeah.
If you believe that the product is good enough to last, then it probably will.
One of the things that Irish whiskey suffered from in Prohibition was because it was seen as a sign of quality. The bootleggers were making Irish whiskey and labeling it. They were making gut rot, being basically industrial alcohol with a drop of water in it and colouring and labeling it as Irish whiskey. So the reputation of Irish whiskey in the States
huge dent
plummeted.
Not only with the States, that dent went worldwide. And I think that's such an important point. Irish whiskey was traditionally more expensive than Scotch or bourbon. So when the moonshiners create their rock gut, they slap a label saying Irish whiskey on it. Yeah. And because they can charge more, basically.
Yeah.
So for generations of Americans, they taste this absolutely horrendous concoction. And that's where you start hearing, I don't like whiskey, it's fiery, it burns. Yeah. Well, that stuff did, you know, but that's not Irish whiskey. No. But the legacy of that is an absolute almost fanaticism now about maintaining standards. standards of quality and standards of taste,
Yeah.
because we don't want that to ever happen again. You know, wherever you are in the world, it doesn't really matter which brand of Irish whiskey you're drinking, as long as it's an Irish whiskey, but as long as it's a good one, you know, as long as you can say whether you like it or you don't, that's a matter of taste and preference.
Of course.
But please don't be able to say it's bad.
No, I mean, the quality of Irish whiskies these days is superb.
Tell me this: when does current commercial information become part of the archive? Because I see those records go up to 1969, but you know, the introduction of the internet for marketing, that's going to be part of the archive at some point in the future.
Absolutely. And in terms of Midleton, the huge expansion back in 2013, the building of the Garden Still House, you know, that's a huge important date to remember. And I genuinely say this to a lot of the new entrants in the Irish whiskey scene, a lot of these startups. You're creating your history right now. So think about the preservation of that. What day did you actually start? You know, was it the day that you bought the land? Was it the day that you paid off the bank? Was it the day that you started distilling? Those dates are important. And it's as important to celebrate a 5-year anniversary, a 5-year milestone, a 10-year, as it is 100 or 150.
Yeah.
So to everyone out there, I would say just give somebody the responsibility for just compiling and keeping all of these, because otherwise, so-and-so does that, so-and-so, you know, collects photos, so-and-so will be gone, you know, so-and-so will have moved on and maybe taken their hard drive with them. Just think about that. You know, you don't have to be 200 years old to have a history.
Yeah.
And you are creating your history every day. So the archive is expanding here in a different way, in that there's an awful lot of more bottles, there's an awful lot more products that they seem to be coming in the whole time. And of course,
is there anything missing from the archive that you think should be there?
People. If I could trap holograms, I would, because what I'm always fascinated by is not the volumes, you know, that are produced. It's not, oh, we took an X amount of barley and we produced Y amount of spirit. You know, that's interesting and it's very, very significant. But I like to know, what was it like to work there? You know, what was the banter? What was the conversations? Who were the people? What was their names?
Yeah.
So I suppose that flesh and blood, I'd love to hear voices, I think.
Yeah.
You know, but you can't. You just can't. No.
I did my family tree a few years ago now, and it's one of the most rewarding things you could ever do. You know, it's endlessly fascinating. You know, you saw family stories. You know, you find out things about yourself that you didn't really know. These different connections, and because of the nature of what you're doing and at Jameson, you must be facilitating that for lots of people all around the world.
Yeah, and like that is an extremely rewarding thing to be able to do, and that's why I was so anxious to get public access to the employee ledgers and to allow people to search them. And you just hear fantastic things. I remember about 3 or 4 years ago, I got a phone call one day, and this woman she just randomly rung the switchboard of Irish Distillers. Our head office is up in Dublin in Simmons Court, and she just rung. Her grandfather had worked for Jameson, and she just wondered, was there any record of him? So they put her through to me, and she was the most lovely woman, and her mother had been widowed quite young, and the family had gone back to live with her grandfather, who was working in Bow Street, and he lived in a Jameson house, one of the houses provided by the distillery. And she had just such vivid and warm memories of both the man and also the whole ambience. And he seemed to be a very indulgent grandfather. And he used to bring home, there was 2 little girls in the family, he would bring home a long stave from one of the big port butts. Those are the largest barrels you could get. And the 2 little girls used to have a seesaw out of it. And that's what they used seesaw on. But she was telling me about her grandfather, and he worked in the spirit store. He was a clerk. And it was his job to record barrels in, barrels out, volumes in, volumes out. If he was around today, it'd be an Excel spreadsheet that he'd be working on. But he was absolutely besotted with animals. He loved animals. And of course, there was stables at Bow Street. And he would pop down every day in his lunch break to say hello to the horses, you know, scratch your nose, bring a carrot, bring a heel of bread. And he worked for an incredible 57 years at Bow Street.
Wow.
And when he died, they brought the funeral cortege past the main entrance, and they brought all the horses out to say goodbye to their old pal. You know, I just think that's lovely. And so to have that lady ring up and be able to share.
You're going to make me cry. You're going to make me cry. For God's sake, Carol.
I know we forget the human element. These human beings involved in the making of all of this, and they still are.
They are. Just the whole process of the whiskey and the people that make it, and the historical aspect. And whiskey does that in a way that there's no other spirit really does. But you could possibly argue rum to a little bit, but there's no other spirit really does it the way whiskey does it. And the fact that you have this body of work that seems to be constantly being updated and evolving in many ways, it lends itself so well to the whole story of Jameson.
It certainly does, and it's something that you can talk about whiskey while having a whiskey. It's quite nice.
Yeah, it's quite
and
clear.
And everyone, you can sip from the same bottle, but everyone will get something individual.
Yeah.
And everyone has individual associations, maybe the first time that they drank a whiskey, the first time they went to a pub, the first time they were brave enough to have a drink in front of their parents. And you have these lovely memories. And it's as you say, it's a very evocative drink.
Yeah, it really is. And it's so associated with place and time.
Yeah.
And which is basically your history. And carries on. Now, in terms of your involvement in going forward with the archive, is there any records externally that you haven't got that you possibly would like to see involved in the archive, or is there anything that you would, if anybody has any stories they want them to get in touch with you or anything like that?
Oh, people are so good about sharing stories and photographs, because for the archive is, you can imagine, it's heavily used by our marketing teams because they want to share what is a very, very interesting story. And consumers really like knowing more about where their whiskey came from. But you often might get a marketeer and I'll get an email saying, hello, send us photographs, from Bow Street in the 1850s or 1860s. And after you explain why that's not possible, you then have to go on to explain people didn't take photographs. Nowadays we have things like product launches and events and retirements. You'd have staff functions and photographs are taken. To make whiskey, you don't need to take a single photograph.
No.
So they didn't take them. Like it's very rare. So we have some, luckily, generally all around kind of 1900, that I think somebody must have got interested in photography at that point, because there's a lot, thankfully. But within family collections, you often have a snapshot of somebody got a camera and they came into work and they took a snapshot. So getting things like that from external sources is very useful.
Yeah, I just think the whole project's endlessly fascinating. The marketing department are using this, obviously, as you say, and that's to emphasise the whole family, the whole history and heritage of the brand.
Yeah.
Now, were Jameson good to work for back in the day?
They were. A Jameson job would have been one of those jobs that you'd be thrilled if your son came home and said, I'm starting work in Bow Street. And I suppose anybody watching this would be saying, well, she would say that, wouldn't she? But luckily, I've got external validation. The very famous whiskey journalist, Alfred Bernard, when he visited Ireland in the 1880s, writing his book, Whiskey Distilleries of UK and Ireland, when he visited every single distillery in Ireland, at the beginning of his journey, he didn't really know too much about whiskey, so he'd chat about anything else. He'd be telling you the colour of the sky and if a little bird was chirping in the background. But he discusses the Bow Street distillery, and he mentions one of the things that people are telling him and that he can see with his own eyes is that Jameson have a tradition of once you begin to work for them, they'll keep you on for as long as possible. Now, remember, this is in an era before old age pensions. Old age pensions only came in about 1908.
Yeah.
So if you didn't have children, or if your children had families of their own and you couldn't work, there's no income. there was literally no income. You were relying, you've no savings.
Yeah.
You'd be relying on charity or it's the workhouse. So for an employer to agree to keep you on when you're well past your physical best is something to be valued. And what the records for me show is that you might have started off your career hale and healthy, you know, shoveling coal or carrying sacks of barley. And as it would go on, you'd get a softer and softer and easier job. And the job for the very elderly was sitting in the gatehouse and just recording who's coming in and coming out, you know, just putting a tick next to, you know, farmer came in with a sack of barley. And Alfred Bernard describes this in his book, and he says he could see a lot of what he calls venerable greybeards around the place. But it is a sign of the commitment to the employee that just because physically you're past your best, there is an onus and a duty of care that stayed with them. And there's actually another good example of that from the employee ledgers, and that's from Easter 1916. Where very famously the Jameson Distillery was taken over by the rebels. It's, if you know Dublin, it's located just above the quays and in between the river and military barracks, so and next to the forecourts. So it was actually quite strategically placed. So the rebels had put barriers at the top and the bottom of Bow Street, and they literally took over the distillery. Now, it was actually a weekend, so there was no distilling going on, so no harm came to anybody. But they held it for a week, which meant that obviously no employee, no staff member could come in, and there was no distilling done. Now, in law, you don't pay somebody at this time if they don't turn up. I mean, that's it. It doesn't matter what the reason is. You're paid if you turn up, and you're paid for the hours you work, and that's that. And the most famous example of this is the Titanic. And of course, when it famously went down, for the surviving employees, their wages were stopped at the moment it sank.
Yes.
Can you imagine? I mean, the absolute cruelty of it, that you survived this horrendous experience, and you know your job is gone, and you've suffered incredible trauma, and you go in and they say, "Well, we're not paying you for Thursday night because the ship sank."
Listen, I would love to be on a cruise liner that sank, because you get the guaranteed £75,000 payout then immediately.
I think it's different times, but for Bow Street in 1916, when nobody could come in for a week, and now there was terrible violence on the street. People were witnessing friends, neighbours being savagely attacked, beaten, a highly traumatizing experience. Now, to be added to that, the fear of losing a week's wages, that means, you know, that's the rent. That's important. And on the employee ledger, there's just a little note in pencil, and it says, owing to rebellion, all employees paid in full. They just said, whatever, we're just paying everybody. And, you know, I think that kind of shows the standard and the integrity and the type of employers they were.
And many people would have been employed.
Historically, distilling was quite seasonal. So the barley harvest would happen in late autumn, and so the busiest time is winter. So at the height, you'd have around 250 men employed, and then that would ease down to maybe 150.
To say 150 full-time employees.
Yeah. And you would, for a lot of skilled craftspeople, they would move between the different industries and employers in that area. So you'd have coopers working for a few months or a few years in Jameson, and then they pop up over in Guinness. And again, different times, different seasons, you might need extra men at a certain point. So you'll find that especially amongst the very skilled trades, that they move between companies quite a lot.
You have the archive for Powers, Jameson, and the two
and
Jameson,
the Port Distilleries Company. No, just Bow Street.
Just Bow Street. So you have. Is there a difference between how people thought of the company or treat it, and how they did things?
Each one has its own personality.
Yeah,
you know, they really do, and it's kind of very hard to distinguish between them. But each one evolved their own system of doing things is probably the safest way.
I believe there's some sort of legal. Back in the day, there's some legal issues there.
They had their own way of doing things.
All right. Okay. Now, Carl, honestly, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. And
well, I have to say thank you, Justin, now for the technological support. Even though we mocked you the whole way through, we're very grateful for it.
No, I'm used to it. I was out this morning filming, and well, I always get mocked, but it's about making people, getting the best out of people's performance. You see, you always want to get yourself the biggest microphone that you can, you know, or something like that.
And the smallest headphones, the wee tiny
and the smallest
headphones.
headphones,
the cheapest headphones work. But Carl, listen, honestly, I'll catch up with you again at some point in the not too distant future, whenever we've got more to talk about. As you,
thank you very much for having me. As
you pull out more and more and more stuff that people just don't seem to lap up. Thank you very much.
You're more than welcome.
Superb stuff.